Some men lift a glass to celebrate a moment. I lifted mine to memorize every word being whispered about my daughter in a language they were certain I would never understand. Smile, Walt. Just smile and pour the wine. That was the sentence running through my head at a candlelit table inside the Copper Fox, the restaurant on Birch Street in downtown Ashwood that I had booked 3 weeks in advance because of the view through the back windows, rolling pasture, split-rail fences, horses grazing in the last gold light of evening, the kind of picture that says you belong here without anyone needing to say it out loud. I wanted my future in-laws to feel welcomed. I wanted them to feel like Harmon County was not some flyover strip between two cities that mattered. Most of all, I wanted my daughter Casey to look around that table and see her whole world getting along in one room. That is not what I got. But I got started with a wine list, and it ended with me learning exactly what kind of family my little girl was about to marry into. Walt, is this truly the Bordeaux you selected? Etienne asked, turning the bottle in his hand like it had personally insulted him. His accent made every sentence land like a verdict from a judge. It is a Virginia wine, actually, I told him, from a vineyard about 20 minutes from here. He set the bottle down the way you would set down something that smelled faintly of rot. How resourceful of you, he said. Camille smiled at me the exact way you smile at a toddler who just handed you a crayon drawing and asked what you thought of it. And remind me, Walt, what is it that you do for work? Construction, I said. She repeated the word back, like she was holding it with 2 fingers. Construction. As though it were something you would need to scrub off your hands before dinner. I build things, I clarified. Custom homes mostly these days. How practical, she said, and turned her attention back to her glass. Practical. Like I had just told her I collected bottle caps for a hobby. I let it roll off me. Casey was laughing at something Adrian had whispered to her, her hand resting inside his on the white tablecloth, and that image alone was worth every backhanded compliment these 2 strangers could aim at me over a plate of duck. I have been broke before. I slept in the cab of my truck between jobs back when I was 24 and too proud to call my own father and ask for help. I know how to swallow condescension with a smile still on my face, because you learn to do that for the people you love. What I never expected, not for 1 second, was that they thought I could not hear the real thing being said right across the table. Here is what nobody in that restaurant knew about me that night, not Adrian, not his parents, and honestly, not even Casey, not the full truth of it. Long before I ever started my own contracting business, I spent 4 years in my 20s working infrastructure jobs overseas, mostly outside a small city in the south of France. I never sat in a classroom to learn the language. I learned it the way you learn anything that actually matters, by getting shouted at by a foreman in the rain until every word finally clicked into place. I came home fluent, and then I came home quiet about it, because nobody on a job site in Harmon County cares whether you can conjugate a verb in another language. It never came up. It never mattered. Until the night it mattered more than almost anything else in my life. Halfway through the meal, Etienne leaned toward Camille and murmured something low in French, with a short private laugh at the end of it. Camille, believing she was completely safe, believing the slow, dumb American builder across the table was nothing more than a man who hangs doors for a living, answered him in French without missing a beat. Like flipping a switch. They think I am furniture at my own dinner table. I kept my face perfectly still. I kept cutting my chicken and I listened. They started with Casey's dress. Camille called it pretty for something bought off a rack. Then Etienne mimicked the way I had mispronounced a French cheese earlier in the evening, doing an impression exaggerated enough that Camille laughed into her napkin to muffle the sound. Small stuff, cruel but small, the kind of thing a man could let slide if he had to. Then Camille glanced past my shoulder toward a little gallery wall near the hostess stand, where the restaurant rotated pieces of furniture built by local craftsmen. And there, framed under glass, was a photograph of a bookshelf, my bookshelf. The one I had spent 4 months building for Casey's bedroom when she was 11 years old, built from reclaimed oak salvaged out of a barn that used to stand where our house sits now. I sanded every single shelf by hand. Casey kept her horse show ribbons lined up on it until the day she left for college. Camille tilted her head at the photograph and said, quiet, amused with herself, he probably found that at a junkyard. Americans have no real taste. They bolt cheap wood together and call it craftsmanship. I set my fork down. Not hard. Not a scene. Just down, slow and deliberate, the kind of quiet that anyone who actually knows me would recognize as something shifting underneath the surface. She is talking about the shelf I built for my little girl. She is talking about 4 months of my life like it is trash I scraped off a curb somewhere. Nobody at that table noticed a thing. Adrian was refilling his water glass. Casey was checking her phone under the table, smiling at some message. Camille took a slow, satisfied sip of wine, pleased with her own little joke, like she had just delivered a punchline at a party where nobody else in the room spoke her language. Except I did. I looked up and caught Etienne's eye for just a moment, testing whether the American had picked up on anything at all. I smiled at him, warm and easy. The kind of smile that says everything is perfectly fine here. You know, I said in English, folding my napkin into my lap. I have always believed that the things a man builds with his own 2 hands say more about him than anything he could ever buy off a shelf. Wouldn't you agree, Etienne? He blinked, then said, Of course. Good, I said. I would hate for anyone at this table to think I don't know the difference between something cheap and something built to last. I let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough. Not too long. You have no idea what you just admitted to me, and I am not going to tell you. Not yet. That should have been the worst part of the night. It was not. 20 minutes later, once the dessert plates had been cleared, Camille leaned toward Adrian, not her husband this time, her own son, and asked, so casually it sounded like she was commenting on the weather outside, Are the papers ready? Adrian nodded, barely glancing up from his espresso. Next week, I think. Almost done. I kept my face exactly where it was. Pleasant, interested in absolutely nothing but my coffee. Papers. What papers? Ready for what? I did not get the full picture right there at that table. That came piece by piece over the following days, the way these things always seem to arrive. But I got enough that night. I got a name, a trust structure. And I got one sentence from Etienne that turned my stomach in a way Camille's comment about the bookshelf never could. He said, The father is so desperate for approval. It is almost pathetic. And then Adrian, my daughter's fiancé, the man who had asked me for my blessing 4 months earlier, with what looked like actual tears in his eyes, chuckled, and said, That is exactly why it works. He wants Casey happy so badly he will sign anything I put in front of him. I told you he is predictable. Then he flipped right back to English, like closing a door, and took Casey's hand across the table. Having a good time, babe? He asked her, that same warm, devoted look plastered on his face he had worn since the very first day I met him. The best, Casey said, and leaned over to kiss his cheek. He is not marrying my daughter. He is performing marrying my daughter. And I just watched the private rehearsal. I sat there with my coffee going cold in front of me, watching the man my little girl was about to build an entire life with hold her hand with the very same hand he had just used to call her father predictable, and worse, call her a means to some end I still could not fully understand yet. Every part of me wanted to stand up right there, throw my napkin on the table, and ask Etienne in his own language exactly what papers he was so eager to finalize. I did not. Because here is something you learn the hard way as a father. If you explode in the middle of a restaurant over something your daughter cannot even hear happening, you do not become the hero of that story. You become the jealous, controlling father who ruined her engagement dinner. Casey would defend Adrian without hesitation. She would apologize to his parents on my behalf. And I would have handed them exactly what they wanted. A reason to paint me as the unreasonable one before this whole thing had even properly started. So I smiled. I paid the check in cash, tipped generously, the whole performance, and walked my daughter and her fiancé's parents out to the valet stand. I shook Etienne's hand. I told Camille the evening had been wonderful, and I meant every word of it, just not in any way she would understand until it was far too late to matter. I climbed into my old Tacoma, the one I had owned since before Casey could walk, patched and welded more times than I could count, and I sat in that parking lot a long time before I ever turned the key. They think I am a fool. They think this is already finished. I thought about the bookshelf, about 4 months of sanding and staining reduced to garbage in Camille's mouth by a woman who had no idea the man who built it was sitting 6 feet away, understanding every syllable. I thought about the word predictable used to describe my own daughter like she was a line item on someone's spreadsheet. And I made myself a promise right there in that parking lot with the engine idling and my hands still on the wheel. I am not going to say a single word yet, but I am going to find out exactly what they think they are getting away with, and when I do, I am going to let them explain it to me themselves, in whichever language makes them most comfortable. I drove home slow that night, the way I always do when my head is too full to trust myself with a yellow light. Casey texted me before I had even made it through the front door. "Dad, thank you for tonight. It meant everything to me that you tried so hard with them." I sat in my driveway and read that message twice. She has no idea what I heard tonight, and it is going to break her heart when she finds out. But it is going to break a lot cleaner than whatever they have planned for her. I texted back, "Anything for you, sweetheart. Get some sleep." Then I called an old friend from my years overseas, a man named Curtis Boone, who had gone into corporate risk consulting after he left the field. The kind of guy who knew people all across Europe. It was almost midnight when he picked up on the third ring. "Bishop, it has been years. Everything all right?" "No," I said. "I need a favor, and I need you to be very good at what you do. Give them exactly what they expect. A grateful, clueless father-in-law who only wants his little girl happy." That became my full-time job for the next 3 weeks. Not contractor, not father-actor. The morning after that dinner, I called Casey before I had even made coffee. "Hey, sweetheart, I was thinking, why don't Etienne and Camille stay out in the guest house for the rest of the week? Save them the back-and-forth drive from their hotel in the city. Let them really get a feel for how we do things out here." There was a pause on the line. "Dad, are you sure? I know last night was a lot." "It was more than you know, sweetheart," I said. "I want this family thing to work." And every word of that was true, just not in the way she thought. "Let me do this." She got quiet, and I could hear the relief in it. That would mean so much. "Thank you, Dad." I hung up and stood in my kitchen a moment, staring out at the guest house across the yard, the one I had built with my own hands the very same summer as that bookshelf. Back when Casey was still small enough to hand me nails from a coffee can and call it helping. Etienne and Camille moved into the guest house that Thursday. Adrian stayed at Casey's place in town, which was its own small relief, one less performance to manage under my own roof. For the better part of a week, I played my part like I had been rehearsing it my whole life. I asked Camille about her garden back home. I let Etienne correct my grilling technique at a Sunday cookout, Virginia-style pulled pork, hickory smoke rolling off my old offset smoker, while he stood there with a glass of wine explaining that the meat would taste better with a proper marinade. I nodded, I smiled. I said I would have to try that sometime, all while internally filing away every syllable that came out of his mouth like evidence, because that is exactly what it was. I just was not presenting it in a courtroom yet. Thursday night, after Etienne and Camille turned in early claiming jet lag, though I had a hunch something else was keeping them tired, I sat in my truck in the driveway and called Curtis back. "Talk to me," I said. "What did you find?" Curtis never wasted time on pleasantries. "This one is ugly, Walt," he said. "Etienne's import company. The one he keeps bragging about at dinner. It is a shell, barely operational, filed for the French equivalent of a restructuring 2 years ago, and never recovered. There are tax liens stacked against the family estate going back 3 years. Real numbers. Walt, numbers that do not get fixed by auctioning off a wine cellar." I sat there gripping the wheel, staring at the dark windows of my own guest house like I could see straight through the walls. "And Adrian?" I asked. Curtis exhaled, and that told me before he even opened his mouth. "Adrian has an active civil lawsuit against him back in France, a failed import-export venture that collapsed 2 years ago and took a handful of investors down with it. Nothing criminal, but it is not nothing either, and Walt, he never mentioned a single word of it to your daughter." "There is more," Curtis said. "You mentioned they have been talking about some kind of trust arrangement, calling it estate planning." "I would bet my house it is not estate planning," Curtis said. "It sounds a lot more like a lifeline. If they can get access to your commercial land through a joint trust, especially something structured offshore, that is liquidity, that is collateral, that is a way to keep the whole thing from collapsing without anyone back home ever finding out how bad it really got." I sat in the dark a long moment after we hung up, letting all of it settle into my chest. They did not fly across an ocean to welcome me into their family. They flew across an ocean because I own something they desperately need. I thought about Casey's face at that dinner, the way she looked at Adrian like he had personally hung the moon in the sky, The way she had texted me that very night, thanking me for trying so hard with them, thinking her father was the one who needed to prove himself. She has no idea she is the one being auditioned, and she has no idea for what. The opening came that Sunday. I invited them all to brunch on the back porch, Virginia ham, fresh biscuits, and a French roast coffee. I knew Etienne could not find a single thing to criticize. "Walt," he began, setting his cup down and sliding into that smooth, practiced charm of his. "Adrian tells us you own substantial commercial acreage near the highway. In Europe, family wealth is consolidated, and we have been preparing a joint family trust draft through our estate attorneys, something to protect Casey and Adrian for the long term. We would like to review it with you before the wedding." He did not hand me a pen. He was testing the water, checking whether the slow contractor would bite before spending real money finalizing the paperwork. "Family to family," Camille added softly, "it is how we protect our children." "That sounds real generous," I said, scratching my jaw like a man struggling to grasp a big idea. "I build houses, Camille. I do not know a thing about fancy trusts. Why don't you have your people send the draft directly to me? I will look it over." I watched a subtle glint of triumph pass across Etienne's eyes. He thought he had baited the hook, and I was swimming straight into the net. That night I sat alone in my study with that folder spread across my desk, reading line after line of language that might as well have been written in French, for how little sense it made to me. Terms like irrevocable trust structure, terms like beneficial interest transfer. I have built houses with my own two hands. I can read a blueprint upside down in the rain, and I still could not make heads or tails of this. I almost did not call anyone. 20 years of running my own business gives a man a certain stubborn pride, and that pride does not like admitting when it is out past its depth. But I thought about Casey signing something like that one day, believing it was a wedding gift. I picked up the phone at 10 that night and called Preston Doyle, my attorney, a man I had used for every land deal and contract dispute since I started my business 15 years ago. "Preston, it is Walt. Sorry for the hour." Walt Bishop calling after 9. "This cannot be good," Preston said, and I heard him settling into a chair on the other end. "I cannot make heads or tails of this offshore trust nonsense," I told him, and I read 3 lines straight off the page, slow, so he could follow along. There was a long pause on his end, long enough that my stomach dropped before he even said a word. "Walt," Preston finally said, his voice sliding into that flat, dead serious tone he uses when someone is about to commit a felony. "This is not a prenuptial agreement, and it is not a family gift. It is an offshore cross-collateralization agreement." I gripped the phone tighter, explained that in carpenter terms, "Preston, they have structured this trust so that your commercial property acts as the primary loan guarantor for Etienne's European entity." Preston explained, "If his business defaults, which Curtis's research says it is about to, the offshore lenders get an immediate, unappealable lien against your land. You are not giving Casey a trust fund, Walt. You are signing a confession that hands your life's work over to pay off a stranger's foreign debts." I sat back in my chair. "There it is. I am going to need everything you have tonight," Preston said. "You will have it in 10 minutes, I told him. I hung up and sat in the quiet of my study, and something in my chest went very, very still. They were not trying to marry into my family. They were trying to buy it, and they were going to use my own daughter's wedding day to do it. I thought about the bookshelf again, about desperate for approval, and it is almost pathetic, about every small cruelty they had let slip in a language they assumed was a locked door only they could open. I did not feel the hot kind of angry anymore. What settled into me that night was colder than that, steadier. I am not a mastermind. I am just a man who knows when to ask for help, and now I had it. The next morning I found Etienne on the back porch with his coffee, same spot as always, looking out over my property like a man surveying land he already considered half his. "Morning," I said, sitting down across from him. "I read through that folder last night," I told him. He set his cup down, attentive now, that same practiced warmth sliding onto his face. "Honestly, it is a lot," I said, running a hand through my hair like a man genuinely overwhelmed. "This sounds wonderful for Casey. I really do believe that. But I want to do this the right way. Let me have my family attorney draft a clean, updated master contract, something simple, something everyone can follow. and we sign it together. All of us. At the rehearsal dinner, in front of the whole family. I watched it land on his face, a flicker of surprise smoothed over quickly into something close to delight. "That is a wonderful idea, Walt," he said, and I would have believed every word of it if I had not already heard the truth a week earlier. "A signing in front of everyone, very meaningful," he added. "You have no idea how meaningful." Camille came out onto the porch just then, drawn by the warmth in her husband's voice, and when Etienne told her the plan, she actually clasped her hands together. "Oh, Walt," she said, "this means so much to us." "It means a lot to me too," I said, and that part, at least, was completely true. They believed it. I could see it plainly on both their faces, that quiet, private triumph of two people convinced they had successfully played a fool into signing away his own future. Days now, just days, and the estate is saved, and nobody back home ever needs to know how close it came. Let them believe it. Let them pour themselves another glass of my wine and toast to it that night. It would be the last thing they ever got to celebrate at my expense. The days between that porch conversation and the rehearsal dinner moved slow and fast all at once. Slow the way waiting always is. Fast the way a countdown feels once you know exactly what is coming. Preston worked with me every evening, building the real story into something clean and undeniable, the tax liens, the lawsuit, the exact language buried inside that trust that would have handed my land to a man across an ocean. Curtis sent over documentation translated and notarized, airtight from every angle. And every single day I kept smiling across the table at Etienne, kept letting Camille correct the way I pronounced a French word, kept letting Adrian shake my hand and call me Pop with that easy grin of his, like we were already family, like he had not sat at a table 2 weeks earlier calling my daughter predictable to his own parents' faces. Casey, for her part, floated through those 2 weeks the happiest I had seen her in years. Planning seating charts, picking out her rehearsal dinner dress, texting me pictures of centerpiece ideas like my opinion on flowers had ever once mattered to anyone in this family. "Dad, what do you think, white roses or the wildflower mix?" I stared at that message a long time before answering. "Wildflowers," I finally typed, "because in about a week, sweetheart, I am going to hand you back a life that is actually yours, and I want it to look like something that grew here, not something imported." "Wildflowers," I texted back. "Always." The rehearsal dinner was set for that Saturday. String lights ordered, the good china pulled out, Etienne and Camille sipping champagne on my dime, believing with everything in them that this was the night they finally won. Let them believe it. Let them raise their glasses. I had a toast of my own coming. The string lights went up across the back patio that Saturday evening, threading through the old oak trees I had planted the same year Casey was born. Long tables draped in white linen, wildflower centerpieces, mason jars stuffed with black-eyed Susans and Queen Anne's lace, exactly the way Casey wanted. 40 of our closest people laughing, drinking, passing plates of Virginia ham biscuits, and grilled trout down the table like it was any ordinary summer gathering. Except it was not, and I was the only one at that party who knew it. Etienne and Camille held court near the head of the table, champagne flutes in hand, my champagne, bought from a case I had picked out specifically for this night, though not for the reason they assumed. Camille wore a cream dress that probably cost more than my first truck. Etienne wore that same easy, patronizing smile he had carried since the night we met, like he was doing all of us a favor simply by showing up. I caught Camille leaning toward Adrian near the drink table, her voice low, her eyes cutting across the yard toward me. I was not close enough to catch every word over the band warming up and 40 conversations happening at once, but I did not need to catch all of it. I had heard enough from these two by now to fill in the rest just from the shape of her mouth and the smug little tilt of her chin. "Look at him smiling," she said, loud enough to carry. Adrian smirked into his glass and murmured something back I could not quite catch, but I did not need the words. I had already heard that exact tone once before, at a restaurant table over duck confit and a bookshelf they thought was garbage. Preston was there too, off to the side in a blazer nursing a club soda, looking every bit like a family friend and nothing like the man holding a folder in his car that was about to end two people's entire scheme. He caught my eye once and gave me the smallest nod. "Ready when you are." I looked over at Casey. She was laughing with her college roommates near the dessert table. her rehearsal dinner dress catching the string lights, happier than I had seen her in longer than I could remember. I am sorry, sweetheart. I am about to break your heart tonight, but I would rather break it now than watch them break it slowly for the rest of your life, one lie at a time. I picked up my glass and tapped it once with my ring, the sound cutting clean through the noise of the party. Conversations dropped off one by one until the only sound left was crickets, starting up in the tree line, and a string light buzzing faintly somewhere on its cord. If everybody could give me just a minute, I said, standing at the head of the table, I promise I will not keep you from the trout for long. That got a laugh. Good. Let them stay loose a little while longer. Most of you know me, I started. I do not love speeches. I would rather be up on a roof somewhere than up here with all of you looking at me. Another easy laugh rolled through the crowd. Casey beamed at me from her seat, that same soft, grateful look she had worn since that very first dinner. Thank you for trying so hard with them. But my daughter is getting married in 2 weeks, I said. And I have spent every single day since she was born trying to give her a life where she never has to wonder if she is loved, where she never has to wonder if somebody is telling her the truth. I let that sit a second. My eyes moved briefly to Adrian. He was still smiling, still holding his glass loose in one hand, still playing the part of a man with absolutely nothing to hide. Not for long. I want to thank Etienne and Camille, I said, turning toward them, raising my glass slightly in their direction, for coming all this way to be part of this family. That is not a small thing. Flying across an ocean for people you barely know. Etienne dipped his head, gracious and practiced. The pleasure is entirely ours, Walt. I am sure it is, I said, and something in my tone must have caught. Because I saw Camille's smile flicker. Just barely, just at the edges. The way you notice a draft slipping under a door you thought was sealed shut. Since our guests traveled all the way from France, I said, turning to face the head of the table, my voice steady and easy, I thought it only right to honor them tonight in their native language, especially since they have spent the last 3 weeks assuming I could not understand a single word of it. I looked directly at Etienne. The color began to drain out of his face. What I said next came out sharp and effortless, the accent I had buried for 25 years surfacing whole and unbroken. I watched Etienne's glass freeze halfway to his mouth. Camille went entirely rigid in her chair. For 3 weeks, I said in their own language, my voice cutting through the sudden quiet of the patio, you spoke of my daughter like a business transaction. You laughed at my work, insulted my home, and called my daughter predictable while plotting to take my land. Adrian scrambled up in his chair, his face flushed red, stumbling out a warning to stop. I turned to him, cold as steel, and told him in the same language to be quiet, that I had heard every word he said at that restaurant table. Then I turned back to the room and switched seamlessly into English. I heard every single word. The sentence hit the table like a dropped plate. 40 faces turned, first toward Etienne and Camille, then toward me, then slowly, toward Casey, whose expression had gone from confusion to something else entirely. Something breaking open in real time. Dad, she started, her voice small. What? I am sorry, sweetheart, I said, and I meant it more than I had meant almost anything in a long time. I did not want you to find out this way, but I could not let you find out after the wedding either. I reached down beside my chair and picked up the folder Preston had brought, the same style of leather folder Etienne had slid across my porch table 2 weeks earlier, except this one did not contain a single lie inside it. 2 weeks ago, I said, laying it open on the table for everyone to see, Etienne and Camille asked me to sign a family trust. What it actually was a transfer of my commercial property into an offshore holding entity controlled entirely by Etienne Rousseau. Gasps rippled down the table. One of Casey's roommates covered her mouth with both hands. Preston stood quietly near the drink table, letting me run the whole thing through without interruption. Etienne's company back in France is a shell, I continued. Flipping another page, it has been collapsing for 2 years. There are tax liens against his estate going back further than that. And Adrian, I looked at him now, steady, no anger in my voice at all, just facts stacked on fact, has an active civil lawsuit against him in France for a failed business deal he never once mentioned to the woman he is supposed to marry in 2 weeks. That is not, Adrian started, half rising out of his chair. Walt, that is not what it. I am not finished, I said. And something in my voice made him sit back down. Casey stared at him now. Really waiting. The way you wait for someone to prove you wrong about the worst thing you have ever let yourself think about them. Adrian's mouth opened, closed, opened again, finding nothing. Casey, it is not what it looks like. She cut him off, and her voice when it came was calmer than I expected. Colder than I had ever once heard from her. You called me cheap, she said. You laughed about my father's house. You made me a pawn in your family scheme. She reached down, slow and deliberate, and pulled the ring off her finger, setting it down on his plate right next to his untouched trout. I was going to spend my life with you, she said, and you were going to spend yours robbing me. She stood up, and instead of turning toward her friends, instead of running off the way anyone might have forgiven her for doing, she walked around the table to where I was standing and stood beside me, shoulder to shoulder, not hiding behind me at all. That is my girl. I turned back to Adrian, who still had not fully found his footing, his parents on either side of him gone pale and silent, cornered by their own words coming back to them in the very language they had never once imagined would betray them. I handed Adrian a second document from the folder, not the trust this time. That is an itemized invoice, I said, for every expense your family has accrued during your stay in my guest house, and a formal notice. You will need to vacate my property by tomorrow morning. Etienne found his voice first, thin and brittle. Walt, surely we can discuss. We discussed plenty, I said, in 2 languages apparently. I just did not join in until now. I picked up my champagne glass, the one I had raised at the very start of the toast, took a slow sip, savoring it, then set it back down on the table with a small, deliberate click. Oh, and Etienne, I said, I paid for tonight's dinner out of my own account. I would say you are welcome, but we both know you do not mean it when you say thank you. I gestured toward the driveway, toward the guest house lit up gold across the yard, the same guest house I had built with my own 2 hands the same summer as that bookshelf. The guest house is unlocked, I said. You are welcome to stay there tonight. But I would recommend calling a hotel instead. The breakfast is better. Nobody at that table said another word. Etienne's jaw worked like he wanted to argue, wanted to salvage something, anything, out of the wreckage. But there was nothing left to salvage, not with a folder full of documentation sitting open on the table, not with his own son's words handed back to him in the very language he had believed made him untouchable. I looked down at Casey. She looked up at me, tears standing in her eyes, but her jaw set steady. You ready? I asked her, quiet, just for the 2 of us. She nodded. Together we walked away from that table, past the string lights, past the wildflowers in their mason jars, past 40 stunned faces, and 1 folder that had just ended a con 2 people flew 6,000 miles to pull off. Behind us I heard Camille's voice crack high and desperate, calling after us. Words I did not bother turning around to catch in either language. It did not matter anymore. I had already heard everything I ever needed to hear from that family. The very first night, over duck confit, thinking I could not understand a word of it. Casey slipped her hand into mine as we walked toward the house, the same way she used to when she was small enough to hand me nails from a coffee can and call it helping. Thank you, Dad, she said quietly, for hearing what I could not. Always, sweetheart, I said, every single word. Behind us, the string lights kept glowing over an empty toast and a family that had crossed an ocean to take something from us and left instead with nothing but the sound of their own words, finally understood.